Hello, and welcome to Changing Times, Loughrea Memorial Group Virtual Conference. This conference, Changing Times, has been organised by Galway County Council's Heritage Office in partnership with Loughrea Memorial Group. It is an action of Galway County Council's Decade of Commemoration Strategy 2013 to 2023. The conference is funded by Galway County Council and the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media under the Community Strand of the Decade of Centenaries programme. In this video, Síobhra Aiken will discuss Galway's female revolutionary doctors. Síobhra Aiken recently submitted her PhD at the National University of Ireland, Galway. A former Fulbright scholar, her publications include The Men Will Talk to Me, Ernie O'Malley's interviews with the Northern Divisions, An Cuid Ella James Finn, Ashley Lamartine O'Deiron, and peer-reviewed articles on Irish language literature, the Gaelic Revival and Irish Revolution. This is Treating Trauma.
Hello, Garza. My name is Síobhra Aiken, and my title of my presentation today is Treating Trauma, Galway's Female Revolutionary Doctors. And I just want to say before I start that I'm very happy to be here today as part of the Loughrea Memorial Conference, even though it's in a very different format this year. And I want to say thanks as well to Mary Mannion for all the work she's put in organising this event. So as I said, my title is Treating Trauma, Galway's Female Revolutionary Doctors. And what I'm going to do in this video is give somewhat of an overview of the connection between female revolutionaries and the medical profession. And I'll be reflecting on the careers of Dr. Bridget Lyons Thornton and Dr. Ada English, who were two female revolutionaries who practiced and studied and taught medicine in Galway. So this project emerges from my doctoral dissertation, which I submitted earlier on this year. My doctoral research specifically focuses on testimonies and the Irish Civil War. And what I'm interested in is how traumatic events are narrated or even exercised in written accounts, be that in memoirs or in diaries or in fictional accounts. But in order to undertake that project, I really needed to start thinking about the concept of trauma itself and how trauma was considered 100 years ago during the revolutionary period. And that's why I've put trauma here in inverted commas, because the ideas that we have today around trauma are obviously very different from how trauma was conceived during the period. The term PTSD, for example, was only coined in the 1980s, and even then it's quite a contested term in terms of how it's triggered, I suppose. And the standard definition for PTSD is connected to an event that is outside the range of ordinary experience, and that definition is something that's highly contested both in the medical sphere and also in the humanities. One of the things that I found during my doctoral research is the fact that trauma is routinely connected to women during this period. And this is just an account from 1921 of the conditions in which women were living in, and that they were in a constant state of depression and nervous breakdown, according to Meg Connery in this report from 1921. But what I found is that women were much more likely than men to divulge emotional distress. Nervous breakdown or depression was seen as something that was characteristic perhaps of women more so than men. So we find, even if we look at the applications for wound and disability pensions and compensation in the military archive, that women were more likely to submit claims for nervous breakdowns because it was part of the vocabulary, I suppose, that they had already. And the other thing that's very interesting is that nervous conditions were routinely connected to women's reproductive health. So the Department of Defence actually sent women who were claiming for nervous conditions for gynecological tests. And the other aspect, which is highly gendered, is the way in which these women were treated if they were experiencing exhausted nerves. What I've been able to see is that there was quite a gender-specific nature to this treatment. Women were more likely to be advised to take a rest from their duties, perhaps in the revolution, to take a prolonged rest of up to 6 months. and to allow themselves, I suppose, to recover by removing themselves from the situation of distress. Men, on the other hand, were treated quite differently, even from the same doctors. And we see with men's treatment, there was much more of a focus on swift recovery and the reintroduction of the patient into the workforce, or in this context, into the war or into active service. So I'll start off and consider 3 significant female revolutionaries who were in the medical profession, and some of these might be familiar to some of you. But I'll start off with Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who's in the centre here. And Dr. Kathleen Lynn was highly active during the 1916 Rising. She was Chief Medical Officer, in fact, of the Irish Citizen Army, which was and she was appointed by James Connolly. During the Rising itself, she was at the Royal College of Surgeons with Countess Markievicz, and they stayed there until surrender and ceasefire and were arrested in the aftermath of the Rising. But in 1919, she founded St. Ultan's Hospital for Children in Dublin. And part of this might be related to the fact that she couldn't get work elsewhere as a female doctor. But she had a very significant role in founding the hospital. And the hospital, in fact, was one of the only hospitals at the time that had a female staff. Dr. Kathleen Lynn was later elected to the Dáil for County Dublin, and she was elected for Sinn Féin. But really, her career was focused on her medical experience and her role in St. Ultan's Hospital. And our next doctor then, Dr. Dorothy Stopford Price, also worked with Lynn at St. Ultan's Hospital. Her revolutionary experience is quite different in that she wasn't actually active in 1916. In 1916, she was somewhat apprehensive about the revolution, but after graduating as a doctor in 1921, she worked at the Kilbrittain Dispensary in Cork. She was medical officer to the local IRA brigade. She also gave lectures in first aid to the Cumnaman, and that brigade was linked to the West Cork Brigade of the IRA and the Flying Column. When she was in St. Ultan's, she introduced the BCG vaccine to St. Ultan's Hospital in 1937. And this was the first hospital in Great Britain and Ireland to use the vaccine. So they were really pioneering in terms of their understandings of medical advancement. And another fascinating medical professional was Dr. Gubnat Ní Bhrúdar. Dr. Gubnat Ní Bhrúdar wasn't qualified as a doctor. She was qualified as a nurse. Her Christian name was Albinia Lucy Broderick. She trained as a nurse in London, but she relocated to Caherdaniel in County Kerry around the turn of the century, and she really was quite an eccentric character. She organised classes on diet for the locals. She encouraged a vegetarian diet, in fact. She also nursed local people during the smallpox epidemic of 1910. And she had a hospital that she essentially founded herself, somewhat of a field hospital perhaps, called Baile an Chúnamh. She worked with Dr. Kathleen Lynn in terms of distributing food through the Irish Cross for IRA dependents. She was strongly opposed to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. She actually heckled her local TD, Fionn Lynch, when he was speaking in the Dáil, at the Dáil debate on the treaty. And during the Civil War, she was shot in the leg by Free State troops and imprisoned in the North Dublin Union. She was released from the North Dublin Union after a 2-week hunger strike, but obviously highly active. And another thing that's interesting here is that after the Civil War, a number of released female prisoners took rest in Gubnat Ní Bhrúdar's hospital in Kerry, Baile an Chúnamh. So that brings us to our next female revolutionary doctor, and that's Dr. Bridget Lyons Thornton, who was educated in Galway at Queen's College Galway, as it was then known. A native of Longford, she came to Galway to study medicine, and she was in her first year of her medical studies when she travelled to Dublin to participate in the Easter Rising. We can see on the slide that the lecturers at the university were actually quite sympathetic to her activism. And she notes in her statement to the Bureau of Military History that the late Dean Hines was very friendly and sympathetic, and I think secretly proud that a student of Galway had figured in the Rising. Laura Kelly's work has shown, and I'll refer to this later on in the presentation, but she's shown that the medical programme at Queen's College Galway was particularly rigorous at this time, and I suppose this just indicates the many steps that these women had to take in order to be successful in pursuing a medical career. The fact that a number of female revolutionaries were active in the medical profession, I suppose, points to the fact that many members of Cumann na mBan perhaps came from more privileged backgrounds, but it was also the case that women were being afforded these opportunities to be educated for the first time. But that's not to say that didn't come with its own challenges. And we can see that from the account of Bridget Lyons' Thornton experience in Galway. The students had a very rigorous schedule. Second and third year students, they worked from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon every day. They also spent 2 hours on Saturday mornings working in the hospital as part of, I suppose, a requirement. And there was also huge financial worries. Bridget Lyons Thornton was struggling, I suppose, to make ends meet because they had to pay for their medical instruction. They also had to pay perhaps for accommodation in Galway. There was also the added cost of travelling home, maybe to see family. And they also had to pay fees to the hospitals where they undertook their practical experience. So it was at a huge expense, both in terms of the work involved and also financial expense. Bridget Lyons Thornton remained active in the revolutionary period after her role in the 1916 Rising. She took part in a number of incidences in the War of Independence, including in December 1920, when she smuggled hand grenades by train to the Longford Brigade of the IRA, and that was under the command of Sean McOwen at the time. During the Civil War, she sided with Collins, and she became the first woman commissioned in the Irish Free State Army. She entered as first lieutenant into the army, and one of her first duties was to care for the anti-treaty prisoners in Kilmainham jail, the female anti-treaty prisoners in Kilmainham. And this was something I think that was quite distressing for her, because she was caring for many of her female colleagues, and obviously there were very strong feelings over the treaty at this time. She went on to have a long career in public health. She specialised in paediatrics, and she would have been very aware of the pioneering work of Dr. Dorothy Price, who we saw in our previous slide, who was involved in the early trials of the BCG vaccinations. What I found is that a number of these female revolutionary doctors also took an interest in mental health. And they also were interested in, I think, the psychiatric casualties of war and of the revolution. Gabnet Ní-Bhruaidhe, for example, actually wrote an article in the 1930s, and she lamented the fact that the mental institutions in Ireland, the mental hospitals, were overcrowded, but she attributed that to the consequences, firstly, of the Wicked World War, the First World War, followed by the upheaval of the fight on our own soil. So she is drawing a connection between the rates of overcrowded the fact that the mental hospitals were overcrowded. She's drawing a connection between that and the events of the revolution, which is quite interesting. And that brings us to our next female doctor, who is Dr. Eleanor Flurry. And she was the first female psychiatrist in Ireland or in Great Britain. So that's quite, I suppose, a significant role. She was born in Manchester in England. She registered as a medical student at the London School of Medicine for Women, but she took her final exams in the Royal University in Dublin, and she became its first female medical graduate in 1890. And we can see here that she was attending the Royal University in Ireland, and that she was awarded a gold medal for her examination grades. After graduating, she became resident medical superintendent at the Richmond Lunatic Asylum in Dublin. And what is fascinating also is that she published an article on her own research, I suppose, and her own practice when she was at the Richmond Lunatic Asylum. And this paper is entitled A Clinical Note on Agitated Melancholia in Women. And it really shows, I suppose, that mental health and nervous conditions were connected to women. That was seen that it was something that affected women perhaps more than men. But she was pioneering in terms of her understandings of the causes of these mental conditions, because up till now there was a tendency to focus, I suppose, on biological or physical causes for these conditions. But Flurry links psychiatric problems with social and life events. So she would have considered things like the stress of examinations, marital difficulties, separation, and bereavements. So she's looking at the broader picture, I suppose, rather than seeing this as something that cannot be changed. Nevertheless, her account here does remind us that there was a sense that there wasn't always an easy road to recovery for many of her patients. And Dr. Flurry again was tied to the revolution. So we have the first female psychiatrist in Ireland or in Great Britain being highly involved in the revolution. She was arrested and imprisoned in 1923 during the Civil War. And the reason for that was that she was treating wounded Republican prisoners in Portrane Asylum, and she was actually concealing them among her mental patients in the asylum because they were on the run. So that led to her being arrested during the Civil War. Brendan Kelly, in his book Hearing Voices, suggests that the asylums in Ireland were actually focuses of Republican sentiment at this time because of the role of Dr. Flurry and Dr. Ada English, who we'll look at next. But I'll just read the quote here from Brendan Kelly because it is fascinating that we have this connection between Republican sentiment and the asylums. Given this level of Republican activism among medical staff such as English, Dr. Ada English, who we'll look at now, and Dr. Flurry, who we just looked at, as well as the various asylum committees throughout Ireland, it is unsurprising that many public asylums were focuses of Republican sentiment during this period. This was apparent not only in Ballinasloe, the Richmond and Portrane Asylum, but also in other public asylums throughout Ireland, such as Carlow and Clonmel, and was consistent with the generally democratised and nationalist nature of Irish local government at this time. As ever, the asylums were primarily social creations, reflecting social and political change far more than they ever reflected changes in the practice of medicine and psychiatry. So that brings us on to Dr. Ada English, who is our second and final female revolutionary doctor connected to Galway. So Dr. Ada English was quite significant. She was based at the Ballinasloe Asylum for many years. She was born in County Kerry, raised in Westmeath, and again one of the first female doctors in Ireland. She was highly active in Cumann and she was also a Sinn Féin TD. She famously tried to convince RIC officers to retire from their positions by offering them employment at the Ballinasloe Asylum, where she worked. So she said she would give them a job if they retired from their positions. She had been appointed to the Ballinasloe District Asylum in 1904, and that's really where she remained for the entirety of her career. She also lectured in the university in Galway in mental diseases. She was appointed a position of lecturer in 1914. And she was given a number of opportunities to move to other asylums, I think, across the country. She was offered a job in Sligo at one stage, but she was very much loyal to the asylum in Ballinasloe and very much committed to improving the conditions for her patients. At the time when she arrived in Ballinasloe Asylum, the asylum was overcrowded. I think there were 1,200 patients at the time. And at this time, these patients would have come from various backgrounds. They would have been experienced various health conditions, perhaps mental conditions, but there was also a sense that the asylums became places where people who didn't fit in with the norms of society often found themselves. People who were ostracized or shunned from mainstream asylum ended up in these asylums, such as the Ballinasloe District Asylum. What Dr. Ada English did is she pioneered very different techniques in terms of caring for her patients than would have been in use previous to this. She was one of the first advocates of occupational therapy in Ireland. So by occupational therapy, we mean that she was very much interested in offering leisure activities for her patients rather than leaving her patients there and encouraging rest and encouraging them to be idle, I suppose. And that's something that I have found in my own research was often the case for female revolutionaries. She really was encouraging these patients to lead very active lives in the asylum. So what she did is she established recreation activities such as sports. There was a camogie team in the asylum, and I think there was also a drama group in the asylum as well. In terms of her politics then, She joined the branch of the Sinn Féin branch in Ballinasloe when it was founded in 1910. She served as a medical officer for the Irish Volunteers from their inception. She later joined Cumann. She also was arrested for her revolutionary activities in 1921. So she was convicted at Renmore Barracks because she was in the possession of Cumann literature, and she was interned for a full 6 months. After her release from prison, she was returned to the Dáil, elected to the Dáil as a Sinn Féin representative for the NUI, and like the rest of the women TDs, she opposed the treaty. However, even though she was active in politics, I think her main devotion was to her patients in the Ballinasloe District Asylum and in improving conditions for them. The other area that she was interested in, aside from occupational therapy, was developing electric shock therapy, which was being pioneered at the time. So we can see there that she's very much interested in advancing and conditions and understanding for her patients. She was finally promoted resident medical superintendent in 1941, having been at the asylums for many years at this stage, and that was the year before she retired. And in 1945, the Mental Treatment Act was passed, and this was a year after her death. And many of the, I suppose, practices that Dr. Ada English promoted were finally brought in with that act. So many of the reforms that she had fought for during her life were finally introduced in 1945, which was a year after her death. But what I want to just reflect on before we finish up, because time is getting away from us, is that she also would have been involved in treating other female revolutionaries in the asylum, and we have evidence for this from Julia Morrissey. Julia Morrissey was perhaps one of the most active female revolutionaries in Galway. She was a close friend of Liam Mellows. When Liam Mellows came to East Galway in 1915, Julia Morrissey was actually his landlady, and they shared common interests in politics and music. And then in the Rising in 1916 in Galway, Julia Morrissey commanded the 50 women who took part in the Galway 1916 Rising under the direction of Liam Mellows. And Julia Morrissey, I think, was very badly affected by the execution of Mellows, and this seemed to have impacted her in her later life. It was a great shock for her. She was remembered for using an Ouija board in order to make contact with the revolutionary dead. And Conor McNamara has shown that the locals in Athenry, I suppose, watched on as the emotional baggage she carried took its toll, and in Conor's words, her eccentricities gradually developed into something more worrying. By the early 1930s, Morrissey was committed to the Ballinasloe Asylum, and we have an extract here from an incomplete application for a military service pension. And it says here, the applicant is patient in mental home Ballinasloe, and her only relative, a brother, is in America, and his address at present is unknown to me. And Julia Morrissey spent the remainder of her life in the Ballinasloe Asylum because of the fact, I suppose, that she was left alone, and because perhaps the impact of her revolutionary experience. So we will finish there, but I suppose what this shows is that there's a connection here. We have women who are both suffering for their experience, but also a number of women who are really trying to improve and advance conditions in terms of the health system, and specifically mental health. So it's a reminder, I suppose, that during this revolutionary period, these female revolutionaries were very much idealistic, that they had hopes to improve society, and that include improving conditions, improving medical conditions and conditions for mental patients as well. Nevertheless, there were huge obstacles for female doctors, and what we can see from looking at these women here is that the only work really that was available to them was work in children's health, maybe public health, and then we have mental health as well. But it might be an indication, I suppose, of the fact that they were very much only allowed to enter certain areas of health at the time. But when they did, they very much were pioneering in the work that they carried out, and strove to improve conditions for their patients. So I've just turned on my video here for the final slide. But thanks very much for joining me. I've just put up some further reading onto the slide that might be of interest. I have an article specifically on how the gender-specific medical management of trauma, but you might also be interested in looking at Brendan Kelly's biography of Ada Inglett and also Laura Kelly's research on Irish medical women from the 1880s to the 1920s. So I'll finish up there. I know there's no questions on this online forum, but if any of you have any comments or any further questions, you can contact me on my email here, which is on the slide. So, Gur Míle Maithagí.